Okay. Hello. Good evening, everybody. I think we should start on time, even though some people have a habit of coming late. But I have a habit of being on time. We have been running a course here with 23 participants on balancing the brain. And it has been a wonderful, wonderful 2 days already, or actually, this is third day. And when we start, we say, let's have a minute of silence. So please put your both feet on the floor. And we have also been doing greetings to each other with both palms together. So right palm represents the right hemisphere of the brain, let us say, and left palm represents the left hemisphere of the brain, just as a kind of, it's not literal, it's a lateral. And let's bring those both palms together, so left hemisphere and right hemisphere of the brain come together in balance. And let's bow to each other, and bow to the universe, bow to the sacred earth, sacred life, sacred soil, and breathe in, breathe out, smile, relax, and let go. Let go of any anxiety, let go of any fear, let go of any expectations. Just accept the mood of acceptance and receiving and communicating. Mutuality, relationship, being connected, being interbeings. With that sense of unity, connectivity, and diversity. Breathe in, breathe out, relax, smile, and let go. Let go of any attachments and any expectations. Thank you. It is my great pleasure and honor to share this platform together with my very dear friend, Iain McGilchrist. We are honored and privileged to have Iain spending whole week with us at Dartington as our guest teacher of Schumacher College. And most of you know, his first book, The Master and His Emissary, was a kind of mind-blowing book. But the latest two books, The Matter with Things, are even more, Stefan called it magnum opus. 3,000 pages,
no.
2 volumes.
1,500.
1,500 each volume.
It's already enough. It's already enough.
1,500 each volume. But they are all, every page is full of wisdom and full of insights, full of good thinking and good inspiration. And so we thought that Iain, coming all the way from Scotland, from Isle of Skye to here, it should not be only for 23 people who have come to do the course. It should be open for the whole community, local community, so that you can all come and enjoy and listen to Iain's exploration and discovery and ideas and wisdom and insights. So with great pleasure and great delight, I would invite Iain to speak to us. And after Iain has spoken, perhaps we will have a little bit of dialogue between Iain and myself, because I have also been teaching with Iain in this course. But because you have heard me, many of you have heard me many, many times, but Iain's visit is very, very special. So I said to Iain that you take as much time as you need to take, and then I can speak some other time, because I live in Devon, I'm associated with Dartington, so I don't have to take too much time. But we'll have a little conversation, and then we'll open for a question and answer from you, and there'll be a microphone, and that microphone will be brought to you, so you just raise your hands and microphone will come to you, and you can ask questions, and Iain and I also, if there's a room, I will answer, but mainly Iain will answer. So without any further ado, I invite Iain to come and speak to us. Iain.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Satish. What I always like about the preparatory prayer is that Satish says, let go of all expectations. And I feel more comfortable after that extraordinary welcome. Thank you so much for inviting me here to Dartington and tonight here to give an Earth talk. As Satish says, I will lay out some things for about 45 minutes, and then we will talk together. Well, as you probably imagine from the title of the talk, I'm going to be talking a bit about the Hemisphere Hypothesis, which is laid out at some length in The Master and His Emissary, and as Satish never ceases to remind me, at much greater length in The Matter with Things, which is my latest book, subtitled Our Brains, Our Delusions, and the Unmaking of the World, which I believe we're busily engaging in, and that's what I'm going to be talking about tonight. I'm not going to try and explain why I believe the things I believe, because there isn't time, so I'm just going to give you the punchlines, as it were, and if you want to know more, as I say, I have written about these things at very great length. So just a very quick introduction to the idea of the Hemisphere Hypothesis, which was an attempt to answer the question, why is this brain that is solely powerful because of the connections it makes divided so comprehensively down the middle with just a small band of fibers at the base connecting the two parts? Why are the two halves of the brain asymmetrical? And why is much of the traffic across this band of fibers, known as the corpus callosum, inhibitory in its effect? There seems to be something important going on about separation of two ways of looking at the world. My hypothesis is that this has developed because of a need that all living creatures have to be able to get but not be got. And in fact, every neural network we know, going back to the most ancient network in any living creature, 700 million years old, Nematostella vectensis, shows an asymmetry in the network, and it's been described as the origin of the mammalian brain, ultimately, and therefore of our brains. That requires the brain to do two things at once. One is to pay very narrowly focused, targeted attention to a precise detail, which is the thing you want to grab, the piece of food, the twig to build a nest, whatever it is, in order to manipulate the world to your benefit. But at the same time, you must be keeping a completely different kind of attention to the world open, otherwise you will become someone else's lunch while you're getting yours. So you have to be on the lookout for predators, but also for your kin, for everything that is going on in the other 357 degrees of the surround that are not encompassed in this narrow targeted attention, which comes from the left hemisphere. In brief, attention is extremely important because it's not just another brain function. It's what creates the experiential world that we all inhabit. We help make the world what it is. And the kind of attention we pay governs what kind of thing we find the world to be, as well as making a difference to who we are. So the kinds of attention we pay changes us and changes the world. In other words, attention is a moral act. What comes out is that from this very narrow beam piecemeal attention, the left hemisphere sees a world of details that are isolated, known, familiar, certain, fixed, abstracted from their context, made explicit, disembodied, general in nature, and reduced to its parts. Whereas the right hemisphere sees, by contrast, that everything is actually fresh, unique, and never fully known, never finally certain, but full of potential. It understands all that is implicit, that nothing is ever merely static and unchanging, but flowing and radically interconnected. It understands that parts are the left hemisphere's invention, and that what are seen as parts are already wholes at another level. But there are two differences that I want to focus on for tonight. One is that the left hemisphere is preferentially interested in tools and machines, which are coded in all our brains, even if we're left-handers, using our left hand to operate tools and machines. Even in left-handers, the majority, and certainly in right-handers, tools and machines are coded in the left hemisphere. Whereas the right hemisphere has a tendency to see an animate world. And you can experimentally knock out one hemisphere at a time. And with the left hemisphere quieted or suppressed, the right hemisphere sees the world as composed of animate objects. It sees the sun as animate. It sees a stone as having atoms in it that are moving and dancing. The other difference, which may not strike you as very remarkable to begin with, but is ultimately probably of the greatest importance, is that between a world which presences to us and a world which is represented by us. This is the difference between the world that we experience if the right hemisphere is able to still the chatter of monkey mind in the left hemisphere and actually be present for once as the world comes into being for us. The difference between that and the theory, the map, the diagram that the left hemisphere holds. And the trouble is that if you use the left hemisphere's way of looking at the world, you soon begin to believe that the theories, the maps, the diagrams are the reality, and all the complexity of the real world disappears. Now, there is a difference, obviously, I've alerted you to this, between the reliability of the left hemisphere and its denial of reality. There are three ways in which I would draw your attention to this. The first is that if somebody has a right hemisphere stroke, they may have a paralyzed left half of the body, at least often a paralyzed left arm, possibly the whole of the left side of the body. But it's very common, more common than not, for them to deny that there is any problem. This doesn't work the other way around. If you have a left hemisphere stroke, the sufferer immediately is aware that something is wrong and is appropriately distressed about it, but not the other way around. And you can ask somebody who has a right hemisphere stroke to move their left arm, and of course they can't, but they say, there. And you say, well, we didn't see anything move, did you? No, we didn't see anything move. And you bring the arm right round in front of them and say, move that. And they say, oh, that's my mother's arm, or it's your arm, doctor, or it's the patient next to me's arm. But never to accept that there is something wrong with the self. And some clever psychologists have managed to interview, as it were, each hemisphere separately and give them a personality inventory to fill out, and give them the same personality inventory to friends and relatives. And what transpires is that the left hemisphere has a remarkably high opinion of itself compared with what other people think, whereas the right hemisphere tends to be a little bit on the downside, but is much closer to reality. So there's that. Quite separately, and in the first part of the first volume of The Matter with Things, I am at pains to evaluate how much the left hemisphere is able to clock reality compared with the right. And I look at attention, which I've mentioned, but also perception, which is not the same as attention, the judgments you make on the basis of what you see and attend to. In other words, you can believe things that are right, or you can be deluded. on looking at emotional and social intelligence, looking at cognitive intelligence, which may surprise some people, looking at creativity. All of these are ways in which we bring the world into being for us. In every case, the right hemisphere is more veridical, more accurate, better able to gauge things than the left. And so hallucinations and delusions are very preponderantly more following left hemisphere, following right hemisphere damage than following left. And then there is the fact that the left hemisphere, having a theory about things, wants everything to fit into that theory. And so its criterion is not whether it responds to experience, but whether it responds to the map or the diagram. Internal consistency. And a lovely piece of research I must describe to you, which was carried out in the mid-1990s by Marcel Kinsborn, who's a venerable Anglo-American neuroscientist, and a Russian colleague, Deglin. And they had patients with one hemisphere at a time knocked out. And they asked them to comment on a syllogism. Now, a syllogism is a couple of premises that lead one to a conclusion. The classic one used in philosophy is all men are mortal, Socrates is a man. The conclusion, Socrates is mortal. But these syllogisms had a little twist. One of the premises was false. So, winter is cold in tropical countries. This is not true. Ecuador is a tropical country. True. Is it cold in winter in Ecuador or not? Now, interestingly, the two hemispheres of the same person respond quite differently to this question. So when the right hemisphere is asked to comment, the subject shrugs her shoulders and says, winter's not cold in tropical countries. It's a lie. But when the left hemisphere of the very same individual is asked about it, she reads quickly and answers immediately, it's cold in winter in Ecuador because Ecuador is a tropical country. The examiner says, Ecuador is a tropical country, then can it be cold there? No, it can't be, since it is a tropical country. Then the same syllogism is presented again. She replies, it is cold in winter in Ecuador because Ecuador is a tropical country. The examiner says, but you do know that it's not so. She replies, but that's what's written here. In other words, does that ring any bells in the modern era in which what it says on the piece of paper, on the form you filled out, is more important than what actually happens in real life? Now, why does all this matter? You might say, I lead my life perfectly happily. I don't need to know which bits of my brain are working at any time. It doesn't add anything. However, if we are able, and I demonstrate that we can, see the imprint of the way the left hemisphere understands the world and the way the right hemisphere understands the world, we can begin to evaluate philosophical arguments. In the past, up till now, people have been content to say, well, some philosophers say this and some philosophers say that. Take your pick. But now, I believe we can say this picture of the world is quite typical of how the left hemisphere would see it. This picture is more like the right hemisphere would see it. It doesn't mean to say the left hemisphere picture has no applicability. It doesn't tell us, it's not as though it doesn't tell us something. It tells us something. But overall, we don't want to be following its judgment. Now, as we lead life headlong, as in the past most people did. They didn't have to engage on Twitter with an argument with people on the other side of the world in 180 characters. We were more embedded in the environment where we were, in the social networks where we were, in the rites and rituals of our religion, of the way of life, and we were therefore had a much greater grounding in all the things the right hemisphere is able to speak to us about. But in the modern era, certainly in the last 200 or 300 years, there has become a sort of deracinated public debate in which you score low if you contradict yourself. Well, that's not consistent, so that can't be right. Unfortunately, I'm not going to go into that tonight, it's quite clear that in the deep structure of reality, opposites coincide. And so if you're truly aware of things, you will find that in ordinary speech, you seem to be contradicting yourself, whereas in fact what you're striving to do is to show that there are two aspects to this. So in the world in which we talk, it's much easier to express the left hemisphere's point of view because it's simple, reductionist, mechanistic. Nothing makes any sense. It's all bits of matter that just collide, and anybody else is dreaming. They're just not in touch with reality. That is an easier case to make than to say, actually, the implicit things are what are important, not the explicit. That actually there are things you can't see and touch, which are still very real, perhaps more real than the things you can see and touch. And you can see what I'm getting at here, that this right hemisphere's take on things is far more subtle, far more complicated, far truer to life, but far harder to articulate. That is the world I believe we've gone into, and that's why I say we need to rebalance the hemispheres. At the moment, the left hemisphere is having it all its own way, and the right hemisphere hasn't got a voice. I mean, literally, the right hemisphere is not where speech comes from. Speech comes from the left hemisphere. And so this is a problem for us. And I believe that, in fact, in the mythologies of many countries that I've looked at around the world, of India, of China, Japan, of the Native American peoples, of the circumpolar peoples, and so forth, there are myths which suggest that there are two forces, and one of them is more powerful and more knowing and more benign than the other. But the one that knows less thinks it knows everything and is resentful of the greater power and tries to usurp it. This is an ancient story that we all tell ourselves, which is ourselves understanding how our mind works from the inside. But now there is plenty of neuroscience, if you need it, that validates this point. Now, where this leads, it seems to me, and what I want to focus on now, it leads to many things, but I want to highlight for tonight what I call the attack on life, which I feel is going on apace in our civilization. The left hemisphere's raison d'etre is to manipulate and to control, to master things. It wants power. Its whole raison d'etre is to be able to move things, to make things, to turn the world to its own will. And this assertion of control seems to have taken over the whole of the westernized world and possibly now spread to the rest of the world. This desire for the only respect is for what is powerful, not what might be more vulnerable, what might be more beautiful, what might be more true or good, but simply what is represented as power. And in fact, I say in the Master and His Hemisphere that beauty has been airbrushed out of the picture now, like a Russian general who's fallen from grace and has been removed from the pictures. The mentality of the left hemisphere is such that it must believe that it is in control of everything, and therefore what it receives is something it has been part of making. It has made the world the way it is, and it has the right to use it in any way. So nature becomes resource, becomes a utility, and there's much more besides. Nature itself, as we know, is being destroyed by this mechanistic attitude in which nature is simply there to provide stuff for us to use for our own pleasure and needs. Equally, we take an attitude to the human nature, that it's something sort of like a machine, in fact, not like a very good machine. Some people seem to believe that a computer would actually not have the failings we have, and therefore we're presented as slightly imperfect or very imperfect computers, rather than the idea that a computer is a very poor simulation of what we as human beings manage to do. And human nature and the body have become up for grabs. It's all the way we want it, and we control it and command it. There is no respect for what nature has given us there. And there is a denial of all that cannot be measured and all that is merely experiential. Well, excuse me, everything is experiential that we know. There's nothing merely about the experiential. There's a small subset of things that can be viewed artificially from the outside, but we cannot get behind or beyond experience. And in the place of nature and its infinite complexities and its wisdom, we see the rise of the virtual and the rise of the bureaucratic. On the virtual, let me explain that with right hemisphere damage, the world literally seems two-dimensional. It seems like projections on a two-dimensional screen. And we're all interacting with these two-dimensional screens now every day in our lives. Interestingly, one loses depth in time as well when the right hemisphere is damaged, and depth in emotion, but that's something I can't go into now. On the question of the bureaucratic, bureaucracies are an exemplification of a certain linear, systematic, categorical, abstract way of dealing with human situations, which civilizations adopt when they have overreached themselves, so that they are no longer in touch with the people, as it were. You are now dealing with an empire, a military empire, an economic empire, as in the case of the modern West and so forth. But something is rolled out, as we say, which is incredibly cumbersome. And this bureaucratic mind is growing apace. Year by year, I can see now that 2 years ago, it was far easier to do many of the daily processes that one has to do. They took only a few minutes. Certainly in the days when you could lift a telephone and speak to a person, they took 5 minutes. Now they can actually take 4 hours because the computer isn't responding the way you want it to. It says, "Oops, something went wrong," which is not a very helpful remark. One would like some indication of what to do better if one needs to try harder. But this is the way life is becoming. It's wasteful of time and energy. It's enormously wasteful of money and resource. We need to thin down management, thin down administration, thin down bureaucracy, and trust people more. Way back in the 1940s, the philosopher Adorno described our world as die verwaltete Welt, which means the administered world. He was already seeing it in the 1940s, before I was born. But golly, in my lifetime, I've seen this come on very rapidly. And what's interesting is we have the illusion of being in control, where there's really, in truth, very little we can control. Rather, we are controlled. And it's not one where the bureaucrats are in control, as in some conspiracy theory. They themselves are also the victims of this administrative mentality. It's a self-legitimizing bureaucracy, a self-legitimizing process. And it's not that bureaucrats are our new slave masters. That's not what I'm saying. They themselves are enslaved by the very bureaucracy that none of us seem able to escape. I found this comment by philosopher of law Ryan Mead in an article sent to me a day or two ago. And really, he's just reiterating what Aristotle already knew, that vice always comes to us disguised as virtue. No exceptions, he says. So we can all be deluded into thinking that something that is very good can, in fact, be very damaging. And that's not just something that Aristotle said, but because he wouldn't have believed in the coincidence of opposites. But when you realize there is a coincidence of opposites, you can see that the more extreme you get in a certain position, the more you approximate the very position you are running away from. The two extremes are much more alike than the position which holds these two in a careful balance, which is what I'm suggesting we might try to espouse. And this is what Jung constantly referred to. He called it Enantiodromia, which just means moving in opposite directions, that everything good has a dark side and everything dark has a good side, and it's just that we don't see it at the time. So it has this move that we seem unaware of almost, but certainly not in control of, that controls us. Has it made us happy? Has becoming affluent, has becoming sort of having our every need pandered to, has this made us happier people, more fulfilled people? The data seem to suggest no. Satisfaction and happiness ratings in all modern societies that have been researched have declined as they have become more prosperous and more westernized. The decline has been particularly steep among women, Over the 35 years between 1970 and 2005, women's happiness declined both absolutely and relative to that of men. The suicide prevalence in lower income countries is lower than in higher income groups, and in modernized societies, higher than in traditional societies. In Britain, while suicide rates have always been and remain much higher for men, roughly 3 times those for women, the rate of increase in suicide is steepest in young women between the ages of 10 and 24. This is in line with findings in other Western countries. There's an American psychologist called Jean Twenge who studied rates of psychopathology in adolescents, relying on serial, contemporaneous assessments using the same objective assessment tool and meeting stringent standards over the period from 1938 to 2007. So at a certain point in their secondary education, cohorts of school children were asked to answer a questionnaire about their mental well-being. What she found was, by avoiding the problems of retrospecting on these things and therefore using a different kind of criterion, but actually using a standard diagnostic pattern, she found that there were between 5 and 8 times as many students, between 5 and 8 times as many students that met a common cutoff for psychopathology in the latest cohort compared with the earliest. And this may be an underestimate because many recent subjects were already stabilized on antidepressants, which wasn't possible in 1938. A major 2018 survey, which charts social isolation using a common measure known as the UCLA Loneliness Scale, shows, according to Harvard professor Arthur Brooks, that loneliness is worse in each successive generation. In the siloed or isolated worlds of cable television, ideological punditry, campus politics, and social media, people find a sense of community in the polarized tribes forming on the left and the right in America. Essentially, people locate their sense of us through the contempt peddled about them on the other side of the political spectrum. There is profit to be made here. The outrage industrial complex is what I call, says Brooks, the industries that accumulate wealth and power by providing this simulacrum of community that people crave but cannot seem to find in real life. Findings from the Cigna US Loneliness Index for 2018 include, and this is pretty staggering to me, when asked how often they feel like no one knows them well, more than half of the respondents surveyed said they feel that way always or sometimes. Approaching half of respondents felt that their relationships were not meaningful. More than half of adults aged 18 to 22 more than half of adults aged 18 to 22 identify with 10 of the 11 feelings associated with loneliness. Now, what I believe has happened at root is that we have failed to understand who we are as human beings, what the world is, and what we're doing here. These are ancient, important questions of philosophy, and I think recently we have completely lost any direction as to who we are, why we're here, and what we're doing. And it's the attempt to answer the question, who are we, that I wrote this book, The Matter with Things. And there are 3 broad conclusions about what has happened. In writing The Master in His Hemisphere, I already researched what happens to a people when they become deracinated from their culture and live isolated lives. There is evidence that actually still leading a life in which you belong with a culture and keep up the ways of life of that culture, even if they're not what we would think of as particularly healthy. It might involve drinking alcohol and smoking and not going to the gym. They have actually lower levels of cardiac morbidity and morbidity in general. They have lower rates of psychological distress, and generally live longer and more fulfilled lives. So our sense of being embedded in a social network is very important. And the important sociologist Emil Durkheim at the end of the 19th century showed us that when people are uprooted, it doesn't matter whether they go up the scale in wealth or power or down the scale in wealth or power, their chances of suicide are greatly increased. The second thing, which I'm sure you don't need introducing to, is that connection with the natural world is essential to our well-being, and that people who are deprived of it become angry, their cognitive function deteriorates, their emotional lives become shallow, they have great psychological distress. And if you bring children from backgrounds where they're deprived of contact with the natural world into a natural setting, even if it's only for a relatively short period, there are amazing changes that can be achieved. What this really shows us is that we belong in nature. Nature is not the environment. The environment suggests something around us, not us, but we are nature. We come out of nature, we go back to nature. And nature is where we belong, where we have our home, and it's that we are destroying. And the third is the realm of the spiritual. I didn't know this until writing this book. I researched it about 3 years ago and found that there was a largely uncommented on, but vast body of literature that shows that people who have a spiritual dimension to their life, in fact, it shows that belonging to a community that worships together is the most powerful, but just having a spiritual dimension to the way in which you look at life means that people lead, perhaps unsurprisingly, more moral lives, but also are far more resilient, are less prey to psychological distresses, and are physically more healthy. Again, the effects of this parameter outweigh those of stopping smoking and going to the gym and losing weight, although those are very important. I'm not saying they're not important. What I'm trying to say is this spiritual idea that is so much held in contempt by many academics and people who ought to know better is actually very, very important to our lives. And the last thing that I want to talk about is shapes. Now, on the screen, you see William Blake's depiction of Jacob's ladder. And I have adopted that actually as the emblem of what is called Channel McGilchrist, which is my website. I always have to point out that this is not an imperative, it's just a noun, the Channel McGilchrist. But what is interesting about this is that it's the only example I know where Jacob's ladder doesn't simply stretch up into heaven, but it follows a spiral. And I think that all the natural processes of our lives actually follow this spiral. T.S. Eliot famously suggested that we arrive back at the place we started from and know it for the first time. But actually, we don't do that. What we do is we come round to almost where we were, but it slightly misses and goes up. And it's this process where we see where we were before, but can now appreciate that we've achieved something greater, which is the insight. And so we're always circling like this. What's beautiful about this is that if you look at a spiral down the core of the spiral, it looks just like a circle, which is static. But it's not. It's moving in depth, in 3 dimensions. But if you look at it from the side, it has this movement which is linear. So it's a very remarkable bringing together of the circular motion and the linear motion. Just to amuse you a little by an invective against linearity, I want to read to you something written by the Austrian painter and architect Friedensreich Hundertwasser. Here is a quote. In 1953, I realized that the straight line leads to the downfall of mankind. But the straight line has become an absolute tyranny. The straight line is something cowardly drawn with a rule, without thought or feeling. It is a line which does not exist in nature. And that line is the rotten foundation of our doomed civilization. The straight line is atheistic and immoral. The straight line is the only sterile line, the only line which does not suit man as the image of God. The straight line is the forbidden fruit. The straight line is the curse of our civilization. Any design undertaken with the straight line will be stillborn. Today we are witnessing the triumph of rationalist know-how, and yet at the same time we find ourselves confronted with emptiness. An aesthetic void, a desert of uniformity, criminal sterility, loss of creative power. Even creativity is prefabricated. We've become impotent. We are no longer able to create. That is our real illiteracy. Well, you can probably gather that Hundertwasser wasn't a great fan of the straight line. And the straight line is actually the way in which the models of the left hemisphere, simple, linear, serial ways of thinking, essential to bureaucracy, are the ways that we now think about everything. And it's the targeting, you see. The left hemisphere is the one that grabs something. And to target something is to see it with a straight line and go for it. But actually all the important things in life can't be achieved directly. With great respect to the American Constitution, you cannot pursue happiness. The more you pursue it, the less happy you become. Happiness is a byproduct of forgetting yourself. So I want to draw attention to curves, to spirals, and not to the linearity of our sequences. There's a necessary opacity of what matters to us. It's not easy to make it transparent. It's necessarily implicit in nature. Think of a poem. You explain it, it seems to have no power. Think of a joke. You explain it, it's no longer funny. All the things that are valuable. The divine is something that, if reduced to a few sentences, is nothing. All the important things. How do you explain to somebody what it means to be in love if they've never been in love? The words simply fail one. So there is a necessary implicitness in the important things in nature. And it's not irrational, but transrational or supra-rational to reject at certain times what reason can tell us. I'm a great fan of reason. I use it a great deal myself. But music, is it rational? Hardly. But is it irrational? Not at all. It's transrational, it's supra-rational, and it cannot be explained in linear terms or in language. So there are limitations in the way we express some things, and our obsession with clarity is at the expense of depth. So I always say that we should be clear as possible, and people say my writing is clear, which I take as a compliment, that I make complex things clear. I hope that is the case. I put a lot of effort into it. But one can be as clear as one likes, as far as it is legitimate, but not a whit further, because when you start to clarify beyond that point, you destroy what it is you're trying to explain. So what cannot be fitted into the Procrustean bed of our language and our concepts is thought of as unreal or insufficiently thought through, whereas in fact what it is signifying is something too deep for our usual ways of thinking. So I'm a believer in science. I am a scientist. It's always been a passion of mine from childhood onwards. I believe in reason and clarity, but I don't think we should push these things too far. And it's odd that it falls to someone like myself, who believes in these things, to point out their limitations. They have proper limits, and within those limits they are very powerful and tell us much. But pushed beyond those limits, they become an obstacle more than a vehicle to understanding. So finally, in conclusion, I would like to talk a little bit about values, just briefly, because it involves another shape. This is the hierarchy of values, which those of you who have read either of my major books will recognize, according to Max Scheler, who was a phenomenological philosopher. Unfortunately, he died rather young, but Heidegger said that he, Scheler, was the greatest philosopher in Europe of his generation, and that he alone actually understood Heidegger, which is quite a compliment. And in this pyramid of values, you see that, as far as he was concerned, at the bottom were those of utility and pleasure. Above them came what he called Lebenswerte, which are the virtues of vitality, things like courage, magnanimity, reverence, and so forth. Then above that came what are called the values of intellect, geistige Werte. Geist in German means both spirit and intellect, so it's a complicated word. But what he meant by this is things like beauty, truth, and goodness. And at the top was das Heilige, the holy. Now, in the way I see it, in the way Scheler saw it, this was the right way in which to approach this pyramid, that the values of simply use and pleasure are not to be neglected. They're important, but once they're fulfilled, we should move on to something higher. And the right hemisphere sees that each level of this pyramid is actually a way of serving something higher, ultimately the divine or the holy. But the left hemisphere has constructed things the other way around. So the idea of the holy is just a mechanism whereby a tyrannical priesthood tried to control the populace. The values of truth, beauty, and goodness, well, they're just to do with sexual selection and keeping a population quiet. The values of vitality, well, I mean, it's just as well that there's some poor suckers who don't realize that they're actually falling behind in the competition by giving people generosity and magnanimity. They should be being more selfish. And ultimately, it's all in the service of use and pleasure. This is a terrific inversion. And if we really hold that this is the case, then we don't deserve to survive. What to do about it? Well, I think in brief, and I'm sure you want to ask me more, and I probably won't have any answers, I think it's up to each of us to push back against devitalization, dehumanization, deanimation, bureaucratization, proceduralization, and the culture of that process that overlays the whole of our current lives. Of course, it has implications for how we educate the young, which is too obvious for me really to spell out at this stage. And I think there needs to be a reversal of our feelings about the spiritual realm as something deeply important to life, not a kind of fashion asset like a certain kind of sportswear or something. Well, I do spirituality and I light a candle. And all. No, it's got to be deeper than that. So we may or may not survive. But for it to matter that we survive, we need to stop seeing the world as a heap of resource for us to exploit and see it rather as being a proper object of awe. That saving the rainforests, preserving the life of the seas, is not about saving our economies or even our skins, but is of ultimate importance because they are the living testimony to, the living expression of a cosmos that is beautiful, rich, complex, conscious, I believe, and responsive, and which in itself speaks to us of the sacred and the divine. Thank you very much.
Very good, very good, very good, well done, well done, well done, well done, well done.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Satish kindly offered me his watch because I don't have one. So it's now bonded to me. You may have to have it back later.
No rush, no rush. Thank you very much, Iain. That was absolutely marvelous, very clear. And you have really brought in your own speech a good balance of right hemisphere and the left hemisphere. You have made it very accessible and clear and yet very profound and in the service of the holy, the highest value, the sacred. So thank you very much. Just before I open for questions, I would like to touch, I mean, everything was marvelous, what you said. Everything was marvelous. But in the end, you said that I won't go into education matter because that's a too big subject. But I would, in this 10 minutes that we have a conversation, I would like you to say a few words about education. Because what I feel that our educational system, when as a young person goes to school or university or college, the young person is looked at by the teachers or the system or the professors as if the young person has no body. No hands, no heart. Only half brain. Only half brain. And they spend millions and billions and trillions of euros and dollars and pounds and rupees and yens and whatever it is on just training the half brain for 10, 15, 20 years. And conditioning that mind that what matters is this light hemisphere of logical, linear kind of approach to life. And bureaucratized, as you said, and use nature as a resource and exploit it for more goods, more consumer, more this. So I think it would be good for you to say a few words about, I mean, the reason Schumacher College was established is to address exactly that. To bring head and heart together, head, heart, and hands together, and whole body education, whole person education, so that we can really decondition our mind to think that what matters is the only left brain.
Yes.
So I would like, if you may, if I may, ask you to say a few more words about education, which is conditioning our mind and narrowing our perspective.
Absolutely. What I didn't emphasize is the way in which the left hemisphere decontextualizes, because, of course, it only sees a small part, and it takes it out of context. And that is one of what William James called vicious abstractionism, which is part of the way that we now think. Things only mean what they do in the context in which they are found. Once you've taken them out of that context, they're changed utterly. And the context in which we should understand what we're learning at school is that of, as you say, the body, but also of a much wider kind of culture. It's not enough to train people, I say specifically train rather than educate people in STEM subjects. It's important for the economy that this happens. Intellectually speaking, some people are very gifted at using this in an imaginative way, but it's not in itself enough to count as an education. An education is drawing out something that is alive and creative in the child, in the student. And this comes from a relationship with the teacher in which there is a spark that crosses, a spark of fire from the teacher to the child. And this will never happen in an education system that's over-administrated. It hampers the freedom, which has to be that of a doctor, of a teacher, of a lawyer, that they don't follow algorithms. They have judgment, which comes from their experience and from their life. And the people who really changed my life were all passionate. They talked with great passion about their intellectual interests. They weren't following a prescribed thing and have to evaluate it in some ghastly way afterwards. They probably all have resigned from their jobs if they've been forced to do that. So that's missing. And I think that without a grounding in history, how to think, calling it philosophy might be a bit extreme, but I mean philosophy, basically, how to think critically, in other words, how to examine your assumptions and the assumptions of our age critically. I think no child should leave school without having been trained to put a point of view and then argue exactly against that point of view as forcibly as they can and be scored on that. It's a very important mental tool. I think children should be taught how to defuse conflict. Conflict resolution is an important part of any mature person's place in the society. I think they should also be trained in mindfulness. This is not a difficult thing to do. You can have 5 minutes, 10 minutes in a day in which children can begin to understand that there is something that is gained from not doing, not thinking, but opening your mind and being receptive. This is actually the only way in which we can understand anything in the long run. It's opening the receptive, actively receptive ear of the right hemisphere to the business of living. And one neuroscientist remarked, I think rather nicely, that our educational system seems designed to cause a functional ablation of the right hemisphere. Yeah. It's simply trying to give us all a right hemispherectomy. So I think those are the things I immediately say, that without a grounding in your culture, its literature and its history, and not just point scoring and taking our point of view on it now as though we're so much cleverer and wiser than people who lived at other times and other places. Instead, it's about broadening the mind, thinking this is not the only way to think. There are other ways. Look at this. Look at what Shakespeare said. So it's a liberation I'm asking for, a liberation for teachers, a liberation for children, a liberation for students. And I think that the principles of Schumacher and Dartington are a good example of an attempt to follow this path.
Yeah, yeah.
And it involves, as you say, head, hands, and heart.
Yeah, thank you. I was once invited to London School of Economics. And when they gave me a cup of tea and some piece of cake and so on, we sat down before my talk. And I asked them, do you study ecology? And they said, no, we are School of Economics. Don't you know? I said, yes, I know, but do you know what economy means? You are School of Economics, but do you mean what economy means? Professors, lecturers of many, many years did not know what economy meant.
Right.
They meant economy means finance, management, banking, administration, all those things. I said, no, that's not economy. Economy means management of the household.
Exactly.
And management of the household is not household only your personal household, of course, that it is, but also your nation and your world and your planet Earth. The entire planet is our home.
Exactly.
And I said, if you don't study ecology, what ecology means? Knowledge of your home. How are you going to manage your home without knowing your home? And they had no answer. So I said, since you have not given me any answer, may I ask you to change the name of your university and call it LSEE, London School of Ecology and Economics. So this is the problem that our economy has been turned to money-nomy.
Yes.
Management of money.
Exactly.
And even London School of Economics, which is the famous university in the world, thousands upon thousands of young people from around the world come, and they are trained in left hemisphere, just manage money and no economy. London School of Economy is not a London School of Economy. London School of Economy is London School of Money-nomy. It should be called LSM, not LSE.
That's lovely. I think that's beautiful. And what I like particularly is you're using etymology. Anyone who reads my work will know that I'm constantly going back to what these words originally meant.
Exactly.
And it shows us how things have shifted, how they've become distorted over time.
Yeah.
So that's absolutely beautiful.
Yeah.
Have you been invited back?
No, I haven't been invited back. But the lady vice-chancellor of the LSE wrote to me and said, Satish, you raised good question. I want to assure you that we are everything for sustainability, and we are trying to reduce our waste, and we are trying to reduce this. I said, that's not the point. I'm trying to make a very fundamental point that your education should be life-centered, earth-centered, nature-centered, and not money-centered and job-centered. That was my reply to the Vice-Chancellor.
And a very good one, too.
Thank you.
If I may say.
So now I would like to open, there's a microphone somewhere. Laura is going to bring your microphone. Please raise your hands if you have a question, and we will, Iain, I also, but mainly Iain will answer. Who has the first question?
Thank you very much for the conversation. I have a question. We're talking about, we need to go back to the youth and help them educate and, because they are untouched by the greasy hands of bureaucracy and all those other things. But is there any hope for us, like people that grew up and went through the system? Like, what can we do there when we get older?
I think you're right to make that point. One thing that worries me is that a generation is coming into being who never knew another way, who never knew what has been lost. And it's impossible to convey to somebody what they don't know. So, or at least it's difficult, not impossible, I should say. And this is one of the reasons why we read history, we read philosophy, we read great literature, is to ground us in a core of thinking on these matters. But I think there is definitely hope, and there's no one thing that I would ask, as it were, government to do. That's taking it from the wrong end. That may come into it, I'm sure, could play a part. But the important thing is we are each responsible for our own lives and for the lives of our fellow human beings. And it therefore behoves each of us in our lives to push back against the way in which we are being taught to behave, and to question, why do we have to do it like this? Why are we filling in these forms? What is this about? I actually don't agree with this. There must be more activism of the best kind, not aggressive activism, no. But in fact the opposite of saying, but I just be relentless, but just say, I don't think you've convinced me that this is the way things should be. We need to have a plurality of voices. It's funny, we live in a world in which we pay enormous lip service to the concept of diversity, and yet only very tiny little windows in philosophy are open to us now.
Yes,
thank you.
The question from Wendy there, Laura.
Hello. Thank you very much for such an important talk and the way you're touching on issues now which are scary. I mean, I'm 83, and so I came being with the war and have seen many, many changes. Everybody was singing about angels in those days, men and being grown. And I'm very left-handed and very left-sided, and this has been, I'm very aware of it, actually, of being quite different. I think this might have led me towards Waldorf education. Have you heard of Waldorf Steiner?
I have,
yeah.
yes.
And training. And I was particularly interested in the kindergarten, the early years. And what we see is that if the child's hands are completely educated, the whole hand, in the early years we give them sharp, dangerous tools to manage, that this is connecting to neural pathways.
Yeah.
Would you agree
Wendy,
with that?
could you just quickly ask question?
Oh, sorry. Well,
Yeah.
I want him to
Yes.
see if he would,
Yes.
if he would agree with this.
I think you're broadly speaking absolutely right, and I'm an admirer of the Waldorf-Schule movement. So that's absolutely right. I mean, the only thing I would take issue with is the notion of reinforcing a pathway. At some level, that is probably true, but I think one can overdo talking. I mean, it's an odd person who's talking all about brains and neurology all the time, but we've got into a habit of thinking that that is more true than other ways of experiencing the world. And I think that the important thing is that they're using their hands, their bodies, as well as their minds. So thank you for that point.
Yeah. Here.
There's a saying that the head is a useless master but a wonderful servant. And I'm interested in, as the right hemisphere moves towards a sense of the holy, that it has to include the heart in order for that to be a complete experience. So I was interested in just that link between not just, we seem to be talking a bit about a disembodied head, and how heart begins to have a presence in this movement towards balance of the mind.
Yeah.
And I think the second part of my question was, is balance an equality, or is it a state where the left hemisphere is serving the right in some way?
It's not equality, it is where the left hemisphere is serving the right. It's easy to answer that. And it's what Einstein is supposed to have said, that reason is a faithful servant but a poor master. And that we've forgotten no, he said that it was a precious gift. And we've forgotten the gift, but honouring the master. I think, effectively, this is something that is not new. It's something known in many cultures around the world, that there needs to be this oversight by a faculty that can see more. It's really a matter of when you see less and when you understand less, you think you know it all. And people who know a lot think they know little. It's called the Dunning-Kruger effect, and it's obvious amongst individual people, but it's also true about tendencies in society, that the ones that are most simple are the most adamant, and the ones that see the complexities are somehow silenced. So it's about recovering that relationship of the master and the emissary. When the emissary becomes the master, all is lost.
Thank you. Thank you. Question there, in that corner there.
If it's me or not, but
Yeah.
I would really like to hear you say something about gender. I've heard it said that women have correlations between the left and the right hemispheres, and talking about balance, not a balanced world with women in control or women having a say and having a voice. And so I'd like to hear what you say on that, please.
Yeah. Laura, after that is a question in the back there. Yes, please.
Well, of course, I look forward to a world in which what the feminine and the female can offer is sufficiently honoured and taken into account. So I'm entirely with you there. When you talk about neurology, to be very honest, it's far too complicated to be summed up. For example, It has been said that the corpus callosum is thicker in women than in men, but it depends which part. And also there are no prizes for necessarily having a thicker corpus callosum. In some ways, evolution has made the brain grow out of proportion to the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum, it can cause problems by connecting or failing to connect, because it contains both facilitatory and inhibitory neurons, or at least has facilitatory or inhibitory effects. So to talk about that simply is impossible. And I'm afraid that the sad news is that when you compare, usually the sexes use the brain in the same way, but when you find that one sex is dealing with it differently, it's almost invariably that where men are using the right hemisphere, women are using the left hemisphere. It's testosterone that causes the right hemisphere to expand in utero, and though I say in my books that the right hemisphere is greater, bigger, heavier than the left, this is largely because half of the population males. This is true of. In women, it is not so true. Now, what you do with that information, I don't know. But as a scientist, I can only tell you what I find. How we interpret that, I don't know. But I do understand what you may be saying, which is that there's something phenomenologically, never mind about the brain, that women can add to the conversation, of course. And so I agree about that.
But also, as Jung said, it's not just the gender. Male also have a feminine, and the female also have masculine.
Exactly, which is not something that's popular to say now, because there's always this war, you see, which I'm always against. You know, it's complicated. Men have their feminine side and their masculine side. Women have their feminine side, their masculine side.
Yeah, thank you.
And I would like to look forward to a world where we can honour and appreciate one another for being what we are, not decrying the opposite sex.
Yeah, that's right. Yes.
Thank you very much. That was really, really helpful and informative. I don't have a question so much as wanting to comment from my own experience, if that's okay.
Please make it very brief, because we have only short time and many other people want to ask questions.
Yeah.
So make it brief.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm an integrative psychotherapist, and I'm also an artist. And I work very much with the body. I trained with Peter Levine, and the whole of the polyvagal theory has been part of that training. And my experience has been that it's a question of supporting somebody to stop, to be mindful.
I can hardly even hear you, actually.
Oh, sorry.
Put it right by your mouth, if you don't mind.
Okay.
Yeah.
My practice is about encouraging someone to be mindful and for us to be curious together.
Yes.
And to listen to the different aspects of their body and their bodily experience, and to discover the level of the soul that's trying to inform the quality of the life that they're living.
Yes, whatever it is we designate as the soul is not in conflict with the body, but is something that is in harmony with the body. And we find the spiritual through the physical, not by turning our backs on the physical, as we find the infinite in the temporal, not by turning our backs on the temporal. Yeah. So all of that I agree with.
Good. Thank you.
Sorry? Oh, sorry.
Okay.
Just a quick question. You mentioned spirituality. I'm curious about religion. Where does religion fit into this? And you spoke about a straight line and how that sort of lends itself to the left. Some religions are following about a lot of rules. What's your views on that?
Rules?
Religion and spirituality.
Yes.
What is the difference
well,
between the two?
This is a bit of a non-answer, I'm afraid, but I did write an almost book-length chapter in this book, The Matter with Things, on the sense of the sacred, and it was the hardest thing I've ever read and cost me more grief than anything I've ever written, trying to be true to what is meant in language that is completely inequipped to deal with it. And I knew at the start that the attempt was doomed, but not to do it at all was to pretend that it didn't exist or didn't matter. So I was forced to do what I could. What in brief I feel about that is that it is perfectly possible to be spiritual without a religion, and it's quite possible to be religious without spirit. So they're not the same things. And the great divide, if there is a great divide, if one has to be rough and ready about it, is certainly not between atheists and believers. It's between fundamentalist atheists and fundamentalist believers. And the rest of us who are in the role of unknowing, striving, fallible mortals to make sense of what we see but feel and are drawn towards. So this is quite different from having rules and I'm right, it's in this book, and so on.
Yeah. Also, religion kind of separates. You are Hindu, I'm a Muslim, you are a Christian, you are Buddhist, you are Jain, you are Sikh, you are this, you are that. But spirituality, the word spirit comes from breathing. And we all breathe the same air. So through spirituality, we relate to each other. And all the words of spirituality are relationship-based, like love, compassion, kindness, generosity, service, all these things. And they go beyond religious labels and names. So I would agree with you that fundamentalism of spiritual or religious or fundamentalism of atheism, like Richard Dawkins or somebody like that, is equally dangerous. So we need to go more about relationship between people and people, between people and nature, and we are nature, as Iain said, and then we can rise above our narrow religious differences and narrow religious interests.
Perhaps I could just add a comment there, since it's so central to my philosophy. I believe that everything is relational, and we misunderstand it if we think it's an isolated thing. I was originally going to call the book There Are No Things, but I realized that that would align me with a certain tendency in postmodernism to deny that there's any reality or truth at all, which is not my position at all. I think it's very important. There is a kind of truth that we'll never be in possession of it, but we need to strive for it. And everything is relational, beginning with the idea that God is love. Love is, if nothing else, a relationship. Yeah. And everything comes into being out of its relationships with everything else. This is what the right hemisphere sees. This is what the left hemisphere denies. It's terribly important. In fact, I argue in this book that relationships are actually prior to the things that are related. The things that are related come into experience for us secondarily because of the relationships.
Yeah, very good. Thank you. Please.
I'm 17 and my education and environment so far has been very atheistic and very rational, as you've suggested. And I'm wondering how, as a young person, I can approach the holy from a completely atheistic foundation.
Good luck. If you have a completely atheistic point of view, then of course it's ruled out for you. I mean, I don't quite understand the question. Unless you can compromise with yourself by saying, well, I don't want to call anything God, and I'm perfectly happy with that. In fact, I problematize the idea of having a word for this, whatever that we mean by God. It's once we start naming it that we get it wrong. This is why the first lines of the great Bible of Taoism, Tao Te Ching, begins, the Tao that can be named is not the real Tao. And St. Augustine said that if you understand God, then it's not God that you've understood, which makes an interesting comparison with Richard Feynman talking about quantum mechanics. You know, Richard Feynman, great 20th century physicist, he said, if you understand quantum mechanics, you haven't understood quantum mechanics. So I think we need to think that there are many things that don't follow our logic, can't be encompassed in our terms, that are still important. It's that sense of something beyond that calls to us, and it calls to us in a way that is moving and draws us to action and to moving towards it. And that's what I mean by it, this sense of something divine or sacred.
Okay, thank you. The question there.
Hi, this might be a little meta question, because you argue in this book on left and right hemisphere, and it's quite an intellectual work. I wonder how much the right and the left hemisphere were present in the process of doing this work.
I didn't hear the question.
Ask again.
Oh, sorry.
Briefly.
Briefly is on the making of this work.
Yes.
how much the left and the right hemisphere participated of it.
Yes, thank you. I mean, people did say to me after I published The Master and His Hemisphere, you know, it's a terribly left hemisphere book. It's full of science, it's full of reasoning, but excuse me, I have nothing against science or against reasoning. And it's also a huge mistake to think that the left hemisphere represents science and maths and the right hemisphere the arts. The left and right come into everything. And in fact, the most valuable part of science, and particularly maths, is based in the right hemisphere. So they each play their part, but in everything, the dominant position, the best one to end with, is the right hemisphere, having taken into account, which it can do, what the left hemisphere offers. Because the right hemisphere has this both-and attitude. So it accepts, it actually was the master that appointed the emissary to do the work that it understands needs to be done, but which it mustn't get involved with. And so the difference is that the left hemisphere doesn't understand or know anything about what the right hemisphere is seeing, as you can see in split-brain patients and in procedures where we separate the two hemispheres artificially, experimentally. And therefore, it has an either-or attitude. And what I always say is that we don't want to have either or both and, but we must have both either-or and both and. And it's that attempt I have made in this book to bring together interests in arts, in poetry, and so but with philosophy and science. Thank you.
And you know, when you write a book in the service of the right hemisphere, so the left hemisphere is working as an emissary.
Yes.
And honoring the right hemisphere by honoring the sacred and honoring the poetry and honoring the true science. So otherwise, I mean, we are speaking here, as Iain said, language is, articulation is kind of left hemisphere activity. But we are offering this as an emissary in the service of the right hemisphere, which is the sacred, the holy, the whole, the cosmic, and all that. So there is no contradiction. And this is why our course is not called against left hemisphere. It's called balancing the brain,
yes.
not against anybody, but how we harmonize. At the moment, our civilization and culture has diminished the master and uplifted the emissary. And so what Ian's course and our course here is to balance that and bring that true harmony between the two.
There's nothing wrong with the left hemisphere until it thinks it's the one that should be obeyed.
Yeah, exactly. The next question? Here, in the front.
Actually, while you're getting to that question, I ought to just remark that all the things I'm saying are incredibly caricature-like and sketchy. That's why I've written at great length, because I want to say subtle things. So in religion, it is necessary to have a contribution of the left hemisphere as well as the right. And in Judaism, there is what's called halakha and agadah, and these are different strains that are complementary. One gives rituals and laws and so forth, but it is in the service of the one that sees the living picture. So these are both necessary. Thank you.
Exactly.
Right. I realize that we're trying to balance the left and the right here. But I remember in your book, your first book, the Master and the Emissary, that you talk about a genetic change. So where the left was trying, where the left has actually manipulated a genetic change. Now, if we're trying to balance, we're having to deal with this genetic change too, aren't we?
Did you say genetic change?
Yes, genetic. You said there was actually a physically genetic change where the left was genetically modifying.
Don't know about that.
Oh, oh really? Okay. I should have brought my...
When people say, so has the brain changed? I always say if you scanned somebody from the 16th century or from the 6th century BC, you wouldn't find their brain look very different from yours or mine. The better analogy is with a radio receiver. You may have a radio set, and when you get it, you listen to a couple of programs, channels that you particularly like. After a while, you start listening to only one. Nothing has changed with the radio set. It's just the way you use it. So our brains are still there in the same way, and it's possible to use them in a balanced way. It's just that we've learnt not to.
The other thing I'm wondering about, there must be some correlation between using your left hand
which will control your right, which will open up your right side of the brain. Isn't that a possibility? I mean, it's like your left is using all the utility.
I mean, we get into it. If you're talking about handedness, this is a whole other question. Have we got time? I mean, no, maybe not. I mean, the fact is that, for example, if you look at the lateralization of the brain in a left-hander, it may actually be very similar to that in a right-hander, or it may be the exact mirror reverse, in which case just substitute the word left for right and right for left in everything I've said. But there is also a group of people who have, and that's the interesting one, sort of anomalous assorting of the ways in which the brain works. And this leads to either great talents or great handicaps, which is why left-handed people are overrepresented at the top and the bottom of most distributions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
There is a question there, the person there.
Thank you. Thinking about the concept of relationality, and as I guess having grown up in a culture that tends to the atomized individualism, do you have anything to say about practices or the practice of relationality? I guess I have a sense that having a practice, in a sense, can pattern us in particular ways, and I wondered if you could speak to ways in which, ways of practicing relationality.
Well, I suppose one obvious one would be, for me, would be a mindfulness meditation, in which basically you are not talking, but listening in an active way. You're opening your ear to whatever it is that can come in. This is the right hemisphere's position of active receptivity, very important in creation and in experience of everything. Once the left hemisphere starts saying, I know it, I've got it, I've categorized it, and so on, we're into an unprofitable, hermetically sealed world, unless that can be given back to the right hemisphere to integrate into a broader picture. So some practices that are spiritual or religious, or simply engaging in things like music, and so on. These are all obviously relational. Music is pure relation. I mean, a note is absolutely nothing. It's just composed of notes, lots of nothings, with lots of gaps in between, and the gaps are just nothing. So it's an amazing thing that the most wonderful creations of human beings are these masses of nothings that move us to tears. So, I mean, it's all relational, both in itself and in the way it affects us. So I hope that possibly answers your question in a small way.
As you said, listening, deep listening, because we have 2 ears and 1 mouth. So if we double listening, that would be a good practice of right hemisphere.
That's lovely.
Okay, next question there.
Keeping you fit here. I was very interested in what you said about beauty.
About?
Beauty.
Beauty.
Beauty. Beauty.
No beauty.
Beauty.
The duty of beauty, but yes, beauty. And it made me think of what Dostoevsky said about beauty will save the world. And I wondered if you have any thoughts about the connection between beauty and empathy. I'm thinking of this particularly in relation to writing fiction, which is my area, but also talking about relationality and how to practice relationality. Is there some connection between beauty and empathy? Can beauty open up the capacity for empathy and therefore accomplish this?
It can, or it may not. There's a much closer relation in my mind between empathy and goodness. Beauty is interesting, and if it were just as Keats said, truth is beauty and beauty truth, we wouldn't have 2 words, because they are really referring to different things. And though I myself hugely regret the way in which beauty has been hounded out of the modern world and is almost not talked about, like a figure in a totalitarian regime that's fallen from grace and has been brushed out of the picture. Now works of art are never said to be beautiful. You'd sound rather naive saying that. They're always said to be powerful, which is the only value that we any longer respect.
Or sensational.
Or sensational.
Yeah.
So beauty is something else, but of course beauty can be a guide to many great great truths, not just in the arts, but also in mathematics. One of the things that astonishes the reader is to hear so many mathematicians talk about how they were guided to truthful results by following the beauty. But I suppose that empathy, I wouldn't align necessarily with beauty, because the pursuit of beauty can produce a kind of rather shallow narcissism. There are some people who overvalue the aesthetic to a point where they've lost their human resonance with the suffering of humanity. So I think it's a part, but not easily equatable with it.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you.
But, you know, beauty is not just visual. Beauty is
Absolutely
also
not.
harmony. Huh?
Yeah.
Yeah, harmony, proportion, balance. And therefore, in the end, when we go beyond language, then love, empathy, understanding, all these things. So beautiful things are not just things, but also there is something beyond things. But we even have lost, as Iain says, the sense of beauty even with our things. And therefore, like William Morris said, that try not to have anything which you don't believe to be beautiful in your house. Everything should be beautiful. Now, we don't make anything beautiful. We make a utilitarian, quick building, speed. That is the present day God, is speed, quick. Beauty doesn't come quickly. It takes time. It matures. An antique becomes beautiful chair. When it's old, it takes time. I'm getting old, 85 years old. And people think that I'm very beautiful. Okay, who's next question?
I mean, I wouldn't want people to think that either of us thought there was no works of art, no beautiful ceramics, furniture, paintings being made. There are, and even music, which went through a terrible phase,
Yeah.
there are now composers who are producing really genuinely very beautiful music.
Yeah.
It was a horrible period between about the 50s and
That's
the...
right. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
So things are turning. I think.
Turning. Yeah. Okay. There. Yeah.
You mentioned that people, left brains, believe what's written on the paper. Do they also believe authority figures implicitly?
It was a good question. I mean, of course, there really aren't, except in the abstract, these people who are left hemisphere people. I mean, I don't really intend to simplify things that much, but I think the left hemisphere's mindset that we seem to be espousing is one in which there are more certainties than I would certainly recognize. In fact, I think nothing ultimately is certain. So there is always room for skepticism, and skepticism is not a negative or even neutral thing. It is a beautiful and dutiful thing that we should do to all the ideas that are put to us, including the ones we most value. We should be able to examine them, question them. And once you stop people questioning, as I think it was Simone Weil said, you have a tyranny. When you say you can't question this, that is a tyranny. So yes. Everything is questionable. That is very important to say now, because in public discourses there are many, many things that can't be questioned.
Yeah, that's right.
You also mentioned that spirituality was like one of the most powerful ways of sort of returning to the right hemisphere. But yet, what do you think about guru sort of syndrome? Because that sort of gets in the way, doesn't it?
I'm sorry, which syndrome?
Guru syndrome.
Guru.
There's a syndrome called guru syndrome?
I just named it.
What does it mean?
It means you implicitly follow the guru.
Oh, okay.
Following some Indian guru.
And that's such a big part of the spiritual world, that there's like the teacher who tells everyone else what to do.
Well, I think it's a great misfortune of good and valiant people to be turned into gurus.
Yeah. The spirituality does not come from gurus or books or churches or temples or any labels. Spirituality is in your breathing, in your heart. It comes from inside you. Spirituality doesn't come from outside. So gurus are like like if you want to light a candle, Guru's function is only like a matches to light the candle. But the light is not in the Guru who is lighting the candle, or even not even in the matches. The light is in the candle itself. And you are the candle. You have the light. You have to find your own inner Guru. Outsiders are only a little bit of pointing the finger. Say, look at that moon. But the finger is not the moon. And people sometimes make the finger as the moon.
Yes.
You are the Guru. You are the teacher. You are the master. I worship you. So emissary becomes a master. So Guru or a matches is only an emissary to lead you to your own inner light. So find your inner Guru.
Satish, can you tell us what the word guru means, actually?
Guru simply means teacher.
Oh, it's simple. Is that Pandit means teacher too, doesn't
Pandit
it?
means scholar.
Okay.
Scholar, yeah. Or expert even.
Okay.
But scholar. I'm afraid this is all we have time for. So we have come to 9:30. I would like to, before I thank Iain, I would like to thank Laura for managing this microphone and running quickly and efficiently. And also Laura and Lindsay and all the other staff, Adam and his colleagues there, they are lighting and microphone and filming and all the arrangements, all the organization behind the scene, you have all done. So thank you very much for facilitating and organizing. Thank you. And also, thank you, audience. You have come in such large numbers and such a good audience and so many wonderful questions. So thank you very much for coming. Please keep coming to our Schumacher College Earth Talks and Dartington events. Please keep coming and keep supporting the events that we organize. Now Dartington Hall is becoming a learning campus. And ecological, regenerative, holistic, balancing the right brain and left brain, that is our future. And we want to build Dartington and Schumacher College in that direction. So please help us and support us to do that. But most of all, I would like to thank Iain. In sort of 1.5 hours of presentation, he has given us a very good taster of his 2-volume books. And I would recommend you, even though you might say it's too expensive, too heavy, but no, they are not too expensive. They are not too expensive. I mean, even if they cost you 80 or 90 pounds, sometimes you go to a restaurant and can spend on an Italian meal 100 pounds. So getting that book, I would say these 2 volumes are perhaps the most wonderful and important 2 volumes that I have come across in at least 10 or 20 years. I have been reading it aloud with June, my wife. So I can recommend highly to go back home and order matter of things quickly. And if you don't worry to rush reading it, read slowly. Read carefully, mindfully, and ponder on it, because it's not a speed reading, it's not a novel reading. It's a slow but digesting and understanding and a kind of feeling with it, traveling with it. It's a journey, it's a pilgrimage. Almost reading your book is a pilgrimage. Well, so with all those, my gratitude and appreciation, I would like to thank you for your presentation, not only this evening, but also coming to Schumacher College, coming to Dartington, and spending your whole week teaching us. Thank you, Iain.
Thank you, Satish. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Satish is on a percentage.
Percentage of love.
Thank you.